If you have a teenager or are a teenager or were ever a teenager, you should watch this show today. Corrie Lynne Player is here. She's author of Loving Firmness, Successfully Raising Your Teenagers Without Losing Your Mind. She has some good practical advice for not losing your sanity, even if you have a house full of kids. She should know she's raised 9 children of her own, plus 40 foster children, many from troubled backgrounds. Great to have you here today, Corrie.
Thank you.
So, 49 children.
Yeah, give or take a couple.
Give or take a couple. That's a little bit beyond the national average, I think.
Probably about 30 times the national.
Yeah.
20 times anyway.
You're apparently still alive, though you've survived.
Right.
But you say one of the main mistakes that parents make is that they're either too permissive or too tough on their kids. It's hard to strike the balance and find what you call loving firmness, or tough love, I suppose.
Well, not so much tough love as to be authoritative, to connect with your kids, and most of all, to just love them. You know, you're not somebody who's trying to make a statue or mold them or whatever. You need to love them and connect with them.
Love them and connect with them. So how do you do that?
Well, I basically have 2 parenting philosophies. The first one is that you need to rely on a power greater than yourself. You can't do it by yourself. And the second one is to keep or develop a sense of humor.
Sense of humor, okay. And I know that religion is part of your philosophy. You mentioned
Right.
on the book that was definitely kind of the structure that brings. How do you keep your sense of humor with 49 kids?
Well, you don't have them all at once, for one thing. And
How many years was it?
it was over a period of about 40 years.
I'm sorry, how many years?
40.
40 years, okay.
Yes, my husband and I have been married 42 years, and about 2 years into the marriage, we decided we wanted to do more than just hang out together, and became foster parents.
In a big way.
In a big way, yes, in a big way.
But you have a lot of grandchildren too, I suppose.
Now we have 30 grandchildren.
30 grandchildren.
Right. And I'm at the stage of life where I'm able to look back on it. You know, when you're in the middle of it, it is hard to keep your sense of humor.
Yep.
It is hard to just keep your sanity from one crisis to the next. But now I can look back on it and I can just say, you know, I really remember mostly the good times. Doesn't mean there were no bad times. There were probably more of those than the good times, but I can look back.
I like the fact that you were very realistic. I don't think you didn't claim to be the perfect parent or the perfect family. You had problems, but yet you had, you know, sort of practical, no-nonsense ways of dealing with all of that. And it got very specific. You know, like I said, you went into a lot of details, and I could actually kind of in my mind see this family functioning, and just, so I think people would find it very useful that, you know, people may have parenting philosophies, but you really got down into the nitty-gritty of kind of the day-to-day sorts of things. For instance, you're big on lists, right?
Right.
Lists and charts and...
Well, I'm a writer, you know, and it drove my kids nuts, some of them. They were like, why do we have to have everything so regimented? Why do we have to? And it was like, well, mainly because I can't remember from one minute to the next exactly who I talked to or said what to, when you have that many children.
What was the most you had in the household at one time?
14.
14, okay. So even that by itself is a lot.
Right, right.
So the lists are one way to keep track of all that. And you had lists for all kinds of stuff.
Right. And you can have it as complicated or as simple as you want to. I mean, sometimes I would just scrawl a note and paste it on the refrigerator about, take your backpack, take your homework, do you have your list? You know, the parental permission slips, those kinds of things, get out the door with. But the nice thing about, and I call it the point system, and actually I copyrighted it about 20 years ago. And it basically manages behavior in 3 ways. First, attitude, picking up after yourself, and chores or responsibilities around the house. And every day, we just made that.
Sorry, I was sort of calculating my own points when you're saying picking up after yourself. I might have had some problems in your point system, but...
Well, yes, and we had our share of slobs. In fact, teenagers are basically... Slobs, right.
Yeah.
I don't...
Maybe I haven't outgrown my teenage phase, that's the problem.
That's the problem. Well, and they operate on emotion. Did you know that psychologists have discovered now that the teenage brain actually disconnects. We didn't know this. A few years ago, we thought that when brains reached adult size, that they were finished, basically finished. But now we know that the frontal lobe, which is the sort of CEO, the organizational, logical function of the whole brain, that part of the teenager's brain disconnects.
Disconnects.
It just disconnects.
Wow.
And I call it the melted brain phase. You know, so
does it reconnect at some point?
Oh yes, yes it does. And that's the important thing, that parents have to be the CEO of the brain. Too many parents tend to let their kids, you know, they look like adults, they should act like adults, they just let them do whatever. You have to help them have the experiences that allow that brain to reconnect in appropriate ways.
Or hammer it back on or something,
Yeah.
nail it back on.
Right.
Well, you talk about, too, a lot about teen logic. They definitely have their own way of thinking. You want to tell us a little bit about what teen logic is and how that works?
Well, teen logic is basically what I want, then that's what is. You know, if in the book I describe a very classic example of teen logic, which I called the midnight movie madness event. And that was when one of my sons, who had just turned 16, had his new driver's license and everything, he wanted to go hang out with his best friend in the world. We'll call him Ron. And he wanted to take the car and drive over to Ron's. And I told him that he couldn't do that because in the first place he hadn't done his chores, he wasn't doing real swift in school. There were a lot of reasons why I wasn't going to let him go. But he got all upset and said, oh, whatever. And then he left and he went and he did all the things that he was supposed to do. Of course, he was supposed to do it over the week's time, but he managed to do it in approximately a half an hour, flying around. He came in and he just, I've done everything, and I even arranged Dad's tapes alphabetically, and just, you know, told me what a wonderful kid he'd been. And I finally was like, oh, well, okay, you can go, but be home by 11. Well, the next thing I knew, he's driving out of the driveway with the car. And he knew he wasn't supposed to take the car without permission, but he had gotten permission to go to Ron's, and he had originally asked to take the car. So in his teen mind, my telling him he could go to Ron's meant he could also take the car. And that probably would have been okay, except at 11:30, he still wasn't home yet, so I called Ron's house, thinking he'd just kind of let the time get away from him, and discovered that he'd left for the midnight movie, which I'd also told him he couldn't do. But see, I let him go to Ron's house, so he took the car, and then he could go to the midnight movie.
And how long did he end up getting grounded for after that?
It was it was a class 3 grounding.
Class 3, that sounds pretty severe.
Right, that was the most severe. That was no TV, no phone, no friends, no nothing. You get fed, and you can sleep in your bed, and you can go to school, and that's it. For about 2 months.
2 months, wow.
Yeah, I think that because it was so blatant.
And that's one thing that you are very clear, very specific about punishment in the book. There, as I said at the beginning, you know, some people, there are different theories. Some people are more, I don't want to say mellow, but kind of whatever will be, and then there are the ones who really come down hard. What was your, you know, how did you figure out what was acceptable for you, I guess is? Well,
we tried to make the punishment fit the crime. You know, if kids went someplace where they weren't supposed to be, then grounding them is then you keep them home. We called it house arrest. If they do things like they don't get good grades in school, then they give up things like hanging out with their friends or going out. We used grounding a lot because that's just kind of all-purpose.
But I think a lot of other parents, though, when you did these things and your kids, the other parents want to know how you actually got your kids to listen, I guess is one of the things, so, right? I mean, because not all parents have control of their kids.
No, they don't. And we had a lot of foster kids too, that we had some communication problems with. But one of the most important things is to make sure they actually heard what you said. And that's why writing it down helps.
Right.
And sometimes we used contracts with our kids. If they were just doing things and it was like, what are you thinking, or why are you doing that? Then we would write it down. This is what you're supposed to do and this is what you can't do. And then they can't say, well, I forgot, or you didn't tell me.
Because kids tend to forget.
Oh yeah, so do parents.
Now, you also said at one point in the book, never trust anybody over 12 and under 20,
Right.
I think was your phrase. Is that part of teen logic too, probably?
It is, because kids will lie.
Well, I think you said they lie you were very realistic about that. I mean, you basically said they'll lie any chance they can get or with anything they can get away with, right? Is that the...
Right. And that's because this is the child part of their personality, which thinks if they think it's right, or if they think it's so, then it is so. You know, it's kind of the wishful thinking taken to another degree.
Well, we will be right back with Corrie Lynne Player, author of Loving Firmness. We are back with Corrie Lynne Player, author of Loving Firmness. Well, you know, these days in the world we live in, I think just about anything is possible, and teenagers seem to be capable of just about anything. Did you have problems with serious brushes with the law, and how did you deal with that? And
well, we did with some of our foster kids. Had come into serious problems with the law. And one of the things that we had to make sure that we did, I mentioned earlier that we had a Class 3 grounding that one of my sons had. There was a Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3 groundings. And so we would make those appropriate for whatever they did. But violence was absolutely forbidden. If there was any kind of violence, if any kid got out of control to the point that we couldn't control them, then we immediately called the police. We did not try to handle those kinds of things by ourselves.
And were they removed from the family, or did you keep the kids? Or I mean, was calling the police enough, but did it just scare them, or did you actually have to remove them?
Well, occasionally just calling the police was fine. One of our kids did some things that he shouldn't have done, and began to get belligerent. And it was a foster child, was actually a girl, and we called the police. And if it got to the point where we had to call the police, then they had to be taken out. That was part of our license, our special group home. They took him and they went to a respite home where it was a kind of a timeout place if we got to the point of calling the police. So a lot of times it would be, I'd pick up the phone and say, I'm calling 911. And that usually, 9 times out of 10, was enough to just de-escalate it. But occasionally they had to know that you would call the police. They had to know that they would have to leave. There has to be consequences. You know.
Yeah, because on the one hand, I mean, you know, you're a very nice, if I may say, church-going lady and all that, but you would call the police if you had to call the police.
Absolutely.
And there were parents who were kind of either, I would say, shocked or just weren't willing to call the police on their kids, or it never occurred to them that they could call you know, if the kids took the car without their permission, you know, I think you said, well, you know, just call the police.
Call the police and say my car got stolen. And especially in most police forces, I know there's all kinds of negative stuff out there, that maybe the police brutality and everything, but police are going to support the family. They don't want another kid.
They know what they're going to deal with later on if you don't stop it now.
And that's an extremely important thing for parents to understand, is beginning infractions against society. You know, a little bit of vandalism, taking the car for a joyride. Hey, it was my car, you know, it's the family car. And they think, no big deal. Any kind of beginning thing, sneaking out their window at night without going away without permission, if that isn't stopped in a way that catches the kid's attention, then it's just going to escalate and you're going to have serious infractions. So we always stopped it right away. We didn't ignore it, because you can't ignore it. You can't think, if I ignore it, you know, maybe they'll maybe it'll go away. You know, a lot of parents indulge in
ignore it,
wishful
or even
thinking.
or wait too long, even, because I suspect you started, even though the book is about teenagers, I imagine you started at quite a younger age with instilling that philosophy.
Oh yeah, when
Whereas,
they're 2.
Yeah, because if you wait until they're 15, it's a little bit late to start trying to do something about it.
Absolutely.
And you also believed in letting them learn a few lessons. For instance, well, I don't know whether your kids did, but the idea of maybe spending a night in jail might wake them up, or that kind of thing, where if they got in trouble, or being suspended from school, or not always rushing and bailing them out, letting them find out what the consequences were. And
I've seen, now I was a teacher too, taught in high school, and there were too many parents who were so embarrassed by the things that kids did that they would immediately try to just, pay the ticket, pay the fine, and just make it all go away. Or they would jump in and berate the teacher.
Right. Not my kid, or you can't tell my kid what to do.
Right.
Which,
and what do you think you're doing? That's just they're just being kids. It's not that bad. And it's like, it's not that bad. They had a party, trashed the house without you knowing about it when you were out of town, and you're going to just let the insurance pay for it and just kind of calm things down and not get upset with them.
Well, when you mention schooling too, you say that it's important that the parents be active and involved in the schooling, and that's one thing that makes a big difference too, and not just, for instance, I believe you said when you were a teacher that 15% of the parents ever showed up at parent-teacher conferences.
Yeah. And the only kids who really did well in school were those who had parents who cared, who had parents would come to school and talk to the teacher, find out what's going on.
Well, and because if they didn't care what was going on in school, then they probably were less connected even at home anyway, so they probably just didn't care.
And I'm not so sure it was not care, but a little bit maybe just overwhelmed and not know what to do, because the strongest willed, brightest kids can be the hardest to deal with, because they can be manipulative, they can be, they're strong willed, they want what they want when they want it, and
you had a few kids trying to outthink you on a few occasions, right? I mean, you always had to try to keep up with them.
They tried to outthink me, and many times they did. Like I said,
You'd catch on to what they were up to
I'd
eventually.
Finally catch on, and I say in the book a few times, I wasn't as aware of teen logic at the time, so I kind of let myself get into positions where it was like, oh, good heavens, what am I going to do now? And it took a lot more effort then. Once it gets beyond it, you think it's easier to just let them do what they want to do, because you don't get the tantrums, you don't get the tears, you don't get the belligerence, you don't get, but it isn't. And kids will try to manipulate you with anger. That's one of the chief teen weapons, is anger and guilt. They, if you loved me, then you would let me do this. And I had kids that would do that. They'd say, I never do anything wrong, I don't go out and rip hubcaps off cars, or I haven't done anything really bad, and you're just really mean. You're mean not to let me go to this activity with my friends, or go to the dance, or whatever.
And did you cave into that, or?
No, that was probably the worst tack they could take, and they figured that out after a while. And then sometimes they try to go to their dad and say, and then they quickly learn.
Usually the other parent, yeah.
And
the
they
dad
learn,
says I can.
Yeah, right. And they learn real fast that if he's a lot less structured than I am, a much more laid back guy.
I met him in the green room.
Yeah,
so.
and he's just a wonderful man. And they would try to manipulate him a little bit, but he found out that I'd said no, and they'd come around me and gone to him. That's one of the few times I ever saw my husband really angry, and it left an impression on the kids. They knew better. They never put mom and dad against each other.
So you both supported each other?
Absolutely, a united front. Now there were times that he disagreed with me, or I disagreed with him, but we never, ever let the kids know that.
Keep them in the dark.
Yeah, well, and we just would go, behind closed doors, we'd talk about it.
Sure. We'll be right back with Corrie Lynne Player, author of Loving Firmness, right after this. We are back with Corrie Lynne Player, author of Loving Firmness. So you made a point earlier, which I thought was very, true. How many people, how good are most parents at raising their kids? Or what, you said, sometimes the parents just don't know what to do. How often don't parents know what to do? I mean, do you think parents are clued in enough on, do people, you're out there writing books and right. teaching, and not all parents are out there, reading the books, let alone writing them. How good do you think most parents do?
Well, I think it's a big problem, Greg, because we're in a society that says yes to everything. We want everything now, we want it without having to delay gratification. Yeah. I think, look at the credit card debts and all kinds of things that are going on. Look at what's happening in our schools. Yeah. The declining scores on ACT, SAT scores. We're rapidly becoming a third-rate nation educationally, and that's a scary thought. So I think that parents need a lot of help, that they're not doing as good a job as they could because they've had what I call parent-centered or child-centered homes instead of parent value-centered homes. What the kid wants, the kid gets. How many kids get cars for their 16th birthday? Yep. How many kids spend $1,000 for the senior prom?
Right.
How many kids we think because we're such a hurried society, we got 2 working parents, so we throw money at our kids, we throw material things at our kids, and we don't give them the emotional love and parameters that they need.
Well, is it maybe sometimes, I don't know, parents think, well, I couldn't do that when I was a kid, so I'll make sure my kids can do it or something, or maybe, maybe they go both ways, I don't know.
Well, I call that indulging yourself through your kids, because we remember, we think, man, I really, I wanted that so much, but that's good for kids. Right. They should really go through a period of time of really, really wanting something, and then maybe getting it after a long period of wanting
Otherwise,
it.
They don't appreciate it, number one, and they just expect to have everything.
Well, and behavioral scientists have discovered that kids who can delay gratification, who can put up with frustration, who are allowed to work through problems, who are allowed to hurt emotionally, that's life, and work it through and find their own solutions, they go on to become successful, happy adults. Yep. The kids who are completely indulged, who don't have any problems, whose parents shield them from any kind of pain, psychic pain or anything, they don't grow up to be happy adults.
Well, you said something in the book that I always suspected, that that even the kids, as tough as you could be, well, number one, I think, even though you probably heard a lot when they were growing up and probably, I hate you, Mommy, or whatever, but now as adults, you probably don't hear that from the sound of it in your book. I think that they appreciate the way that you raise them. And you hear that a lot, or as I say, that's what I've always suspected, is that the kids actually want to be disciplined in a strange kind of way. And you talk about your son, I think, in that sort of a situation where, and if they don't, they think the parents don't care. Like sometimes they were almost testing you to see if you would do something, and then if you didn't, they thought,
almost testing is not the right word. Testing is the right word. They do. They completely, that's part of how they grow up. That's how that brain gets rewired so that it becomes an adult, mature brain, is to test the boundaries and find out, oh, it's still there. Oh, that's right. That's what I have to do. I can't do this, and I can do this, and I can work it out for myself.
And your kids do now appreciate the way, what they went through then, and that you think it sunk in?
Oh, yeah, I think so. Well, the ones that really appreciate it are the ones who've got their own teenagers now.
Exactly.
And I get phone calls, and it's like, oh, or I get like, I'm so sorry, Mom, please forgive me.
I must have been a real jerk to raise.
No, they know they weren't, and they know how much they're loved, but they do. It's a startling thing.
But they're implementing your own principles now?
Sort of, yes, basically. The basic principles are there. Our kids are so different, all of them, that they do it in different ways.
Well, thank you very much, Corrie Lynne Player. The book is Loving Firmness: How to Successfully Raising Teenagers Without Losing Your Mind. Thanks everybody for watching. We'll see you next time.